Mr. Bera.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this important hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for having the courage, at some risk, to step up and share the stories. It's incredibly important, and to have a platform such as this. You know, when I think about my introduction to activism, it was as a young college student in the apartheid movement in the early 80s and so forth. And it almost as though we've got to create public awareness and a similar movement to build on what I hope are, our core values as the United States of America of human rights and human decency, and not sit silent. Dr. Richardson, you might have the best perspective on this. Obviously, China controls the flow of information within China, information from Hong Kong, information from Xinjiang. How much does the rest of the Chinese domestic population know what's happening within their own borders?
Getting at that kind of information requires a couple of things. First, access to a really good VPN, which has gotten much harder, but it also requires knowing to ask, knowing enough to go looking. And if you have been told all your life that Xinjiang is a hotbed of terrorism and therefore Chinese government policies in the region are justified, and you've never had the opportunity to second guess that or been given reason to do that, you're probably not going to. And some of my colleagues speak very eloquently about the very jarring reality of, for example, leaving the country to come to school, for example, in the US, and being confronted with a completely different set of facts and going through the process of understanding not just that what you've been taught all of your life is at best questionable, if not, completely fictitious, but then the process of relearning and understanding how you can actually give credence to certain kinds of information. It's very challenging on many levels.
And what tools do we have, say, in the multilateral Western world to get information into China about potentially what's going on?
I think that ranges everywhere from anti-circumvention technology, or I should say pro-circumvention technology, to the wonderful work that's done by different services like VOA and RFA. I think keeping the doors open to students and to scholars who want to come to the United States is critical, and treating that impulse as an opportunity for solidarity rather than just a national security issue, which is really how it's been discussed here for the last year. I think those are all important ways of giving people access to alternative narratives and information.
You touched on the role of the U.S. corporate sector as well as academic institutions, and certainly, again, going back to my introduction in the early 80s, some of that was putting pressure on the U.S. corporate sector as well as the U.S. academic sector. At this juncture, do you see much of that happening at the grassroots level, or from a state-by-state perspective, or is it still very early?
I would say that it's very fragmented, and I think there are very different discussions about the involvement of companies and the kinds of due diligence standards that they're expected to uphold. I think the discussion for and about universities is different, which is not necessarily to say that some of them aren't just as problematic in their relationships, but I think they have a different set of responsibilities and obligations. I think universities are really struggling to understand the scope of threats to academic freedom that stem from Chinese government pressure. They seem to think, for the most part, that unless a Chinese diplomat is, for example, telling them they can't have, telling a senior level administrator that they can't have a particular event on campus, that there aren't problems. They aren't looking at examples like at the UC Davis campus a couple of weeks ago, pro-Beijing students ripping down Lenin walls and other pro-democracy Hong Kong materials. The school isn't proactively saying, in a very broad sense, you can't do that, and taking a stand on issues like that. Some of it is very sort of micro-level awareness that big institutions, I think, are struggling to get their heads around.
So probably, one thing that definitely is within our control here in the U.S. domestically is to raise that awareness, to make sure proper information is getting out to the U.S. corporate social responsibility community, and certainly to the big academic institutions and that flow of information getting out there. And again, not going to be easy, but certainly I think is incredibly important to create both a grassroots movement. One last question, kind of on the multilateralism, where Western democracies, countries that share similar values of openness and human rights, we haven't heard as much of that kind of multilateral coalition coming together to exert pressure or exert economic pressure. And are you seeing some of that coming together? Or
I guess maybe I have a bit of a different view on that. I mean, that 25 governments, not including the United States,
and maybe that's the perspective that
came together in July to offer up the first serious criticism via the Human Rights Council president about Xinjiang calling for access.
And maybe playing off of that, how diminished is our role by not being part of the UN human rights community right now?
Well, it's about being part of the Human Rights Council particularly, but I can't in 5 seconds answer. It is enormously problematic. Other governments want the U.S. leadership. They want the air cover.
Thank you.
Great, thank